This is Channel F Podcasting. You're listening to Channel F. Back in 1968, my next guest moved to Canada, in Toronto specifically. He very quickly fell in love with the music scene and the nightlife of Toronto at that time, and immersed himself in it deeply. After 15 years of working for the CBC as a set constructor or carpenter for set design on the likes of Mercer Show and Air Farce, now in his 70s, he decided he wanted to leave a legacy behind, and during the time of COVID, decided he would show his love for the music, and particularly the venues of this city, by building miniatures of the now silent musical landmarks where live music was played. I reached Andrew Smith at his home in Toronto. Okay, I'm happy to have Andrew Smith on the line today on this episode. Andrew made a series of miniatures that eventually got exhibited, and it's called Toronto, Lost Music City. And it's an homage to live music venues from Toronto's history. So how did you come about doing this? What was the impetus for doing this, Andrew?
Good afternoon, Faisal. Well, to preserve my sanity. When the pandemic obviously was going to be around for a while, I decided that I needed to do something to keep myself busy.
Yeah.
So I made myself a workshop in the basement and started tinkering.
Right.
One of the things that I've done a bunch of is made little libraries. And I made a little library for a woman a year ago. And what we did was we recreated her house.
Right.
And it worked so well. And that was the point where my brain went, doors can be sculptural. I could make anything as a little library.
Right.
And at that point, my brain went, I could even do the silver dollar as a little library.
Right.
And so that's what I started doing.
Can you explain just briefly what a little library is? Because some listeners might not know.
A little library basically is a box that somebody puts on their front lawn with a sign on it that says, take a book, leave a book.
Right.
And it's a fairly wide growing movement these days.
Yeah, and you find it in small communities everywhere, some neighborhoods and that kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, the one I have in my front is looks like a gate into a hedge, which was inspired by a book by that name.
Oh, okay. So there are all kinds of inspirations for them, and they're all kinds of, and then they're different types.
They're all different, yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful range of creative thought all across North America.
Yeah. So that was the impetus then, was it, for you to get started on this?
The silver dollar was the first one, and at that point, I was thinking iconic signage.
Right.
And so after I did that one, there was a restaurant here in Toronto called The Real Jerk.
Okay.
When it was down on Broadview, and it had this whole side of a wall painted with a big sun on it and a big palm leaf. And so I did that one.
So they were quite striking places, striking venues. And you say that quite a few of them are now closed and silent.
That became, the one I did after The Real Jerk was the Matador, which is an old after-hours ballroom nightclub.
Yeah.
And the response I got to that was so amazing.
Right.
That was when I realized that it was music venues that was what people were enjoying. That was the niche that I found.
It really struck a chord.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
And so that was when the idea for this whole series came about. And my parameters were, it had to have been a venue that had live music, and it had to be a venue that was now closed.
And of course, you couldn't get all of them, but you did a great job as far as...
I've got a long list.
Yeah, no, the list is very long. And
it keeps getting longer.
Yeah, so you're continuing this, are you?
I have a feeling I'm going to be doing this one for a long time.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, I was going to say.
It fills a need in me that I really like.
Yeah.
I'm a creative. I got to create.
Yeah.
If we don't create, I go crazy.
Yeah.
So there's that. I also have a really profound love of history.
Right.
And so this feeds that. And I've been in this town for 50 years, and I really like Toronto. It feeds all three of those.
There definitely needs to be a kind of a historical account, a record of the music scene in Toronto, the cultural history of Toronto. So I think people are doing a lot of that now, but this is really unique. I've never seen this take on it.
Well, that was sort of one of the another reason why I started doing it. I was an art photographer for a while,
Right.
but art photographers are a dime a dozen these days.
Yep.
And so doing this it uses up all my skill sets.
Yeah.
And it's a fairly unusual skill set. So
would you classify it as folk art?
Kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. I consider them to be caricatures.
Okay.
In that I idealize, I gloss over.
Yeah.
I take a little artistic license here and there. I'm not going for photographic detail.
No.
I'm going for flavor. So yeah, folk art works.
And they're quite accurate to some degree. I mean, as you said, they're not carbon copies or anything like that.
No, but I am fairly meticulous about my dimensions.
Yeah.
That's, again, back to skill set. I specialize in building massive stages for award shows.
Okay.
So it was taking a drawing on a small piece of paper.
Yeah.
And turning it into something that was hockey rink sized.
Right.
And so to do it this way, to take pictures of a building and then scale it down to something that is the size of a piece of paper is kind of fun.
Yeah. And it's funny because they look like they would see them from the street.
That was the venue that they were in, is a friend of mine's gallery.
Okay.
And so she's opened up this gallery, and what she does is she lets out her window.
Right.
To artists.
Yeah. When I actually looked at them, the memory I had of them right away was what they looked like as I was passing by.
Good.
You know, if I was walking down Yonge Street and I passed by the gasworks and the Colonial, but the gasworks, it really stood out.
Yeah, it was a nice dirty one.
It really, that's why I recognized it right away, because I'd walked by it so many times and it really looked that way as you were walking. I really got the sense I was walking southbound on Yonge Street.
Yes, that's very good, because I did do the corner in that direction.
Yeah. On Yonge Street, I thought I was walking southbound, and I saw it from that angle. So that really struck me. You know, it's one of the things I was going to ask you is your process. How did you go about that? You said it was basically a photograph, and you took your vision from that and put together what you were doing.
To some degree, yes. One of the things I found once I started doing this was I needed photographs. And in many cases, the photographic record is atrocious. That's another reason why I've had to take artistic license. It's surprising in this day and age of so many photographs how the public record seems to be thumbnails.
Yeah.
And so in some respects, I almost feel like I'm making a record that can be viewed later and down the road a piece. In essence, what it is finding a photograph that I can take a look at it straight on.
Right.
If I can't look at it straight on, I can throw it into Photoshop and straighten it.
Yeah.
And then I can throw it into another program, and I can basically draw boxes on top of it. And then that gives me a size.
Okay.
Gives me the scale of things that I need to cut and whatnot. And from there, it's basically old carpentry skills. Cut a piece of wood this size, cut a piece of plastic that size.
Yeah.
What can I use to do this? I've always liked finding materials and using them for purposes for which they were not intended.
So in some ways, it's mixed media, isn't it, I guess, with the kind of medias that you were using?
Yeah. To do it nowadays with the tools that I have available, with basically computers and programs and whatnot, to come up with the drawings is considerably easier than it would have been 10, 15 years ago.
So did you use like a CAD software or just software?
Basically, what I use Lightroom, Photoshop for the pictures.
Yeah.
And then my go-to program is Inkscape, because it was cheap and free.
Yeah. The actual photographs, were they from the internet originally? Was it
almost exclusively?
Okay, yeah.
And as far as buildings that are closed in the past 20 years, I have to give a big shout out to Google Earth Street View, because without it, I would be lost.
Okay, that's great. So you did all this, and many of the places that you have recreated are now closed and silent. I just wondered, how did that make you feel?
Well, there's obviously a sadness.
Yeah.
I've been in almost all of these clubs at some point in my life.
Yeah.
Some more than others.
Yeah.
And some phenomenal music that I've seen. I mean, I have a great love of live music.
Right.
I also realize that that's also the evolution of a city.
Yeah.
Club owners get old and die.
Yeah.
They run out of money. Pandemics hit. Yeah. So it's not unusual for clubs to disappear. I think we're just feeling it a lot more right now with the pandemic situation is that it seems to be more noticeable that so many closed all at one time.
I'm of two minds about this. I mean, on the one hand, I understand the concentration of populations and density and that kind of thing, but a lot of these developments are really cutting through huge swaths of land downtown and history to some degree.
Well,
I mean, there's no doubt that the condo craze has definitely had an impact, and really been responsible for doing away with many of the areas that these venues were in. On the other hand, this explosion in populations may be creating a new audience for live music and a renaissance of live music venues.
it's true. I was thinking about that just the other day. That this town has grown so rapidly in the past few
You're
years.
telling me.
Um, where City Hall was 100 years ago was tar paper shacks and slums.
Yeah.
50 years ago, when I arrived in Toronto, I can remember going to Steeles Avenue and looking north and seeing nothing but farmland, absolutely nothing but dirt.
Yeah.
It changed a tremendous amount.
Yeah.
And then Toronto has always had an unofficial love affair with builders and developers.
Yeah.
They have, I won't say run roughshod, but they have
Yeah.
throughout the city over the past 50 years.
Yeah.
And one of the things about walking down Yonge Street was that it was mom and pop Storeville.
Yeah.
And one of the things about nightclubs is nightclubs are personality driven.
Right.
Nightclubs are not chain stores. They are not franchise operations.
Yeah.
They are run by somebody who has a vision to make a club. And that, I think, is what's disappearing from this city, is that we are becoming a franchise city.
Yeah.
And doesn't bode well for me.
And I agree with you on that point. I mean, it's one of the things I did notice, and I guess the prime example of that is the Omacombo of a place trying to stay vital and new, and it's gone through a series of ownerships, I guess, in the last 20 years.
Yeah,
and it's one of those places that's still trying to make itself, relevant. And of course, as you point out, the pandemic has been a real problem. That's for sure with live venues. And even though I know that some of the venues that tried to keep, they tried doing virtual concerts and that kind of thing. But I suppose in some ways it's still pretty hard to get bums in the seats, really, in some way.
Yeah, I mean, that was where their money came from, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I have to say that those clubs, especially at night, created a huge amount of vibrancy on the street.
Oh, yeah. That was why it was safe to go downtown.
Yeah. Because it's funny you should say that, because I remember standing in line at the Bamboo Club, and there was you remember the Bamboo used to have huge lineups all the way over to Spadina almost, and basically in front of me there was some university kids from Chicago, and they were absolutely petrified that we were standing outside. Their eyes were darting around all over the place, and I kind of...
Where's it coming from?
Yeah, and I understood. And I said to them, what's going on? You guys seemed a little bit freaked out about standing in line. And they told me they were from Chicago. And the first thing I said was, don't worry, you're in Toronto now. You have absolutely nothing to worry about. And I think that at that point, they suddenly realized it wasn't as bad as, say, someplace like Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed taking my American friends down to the worst parts of downtown Toronto for that very reason.
Yeah.
We've been very blessed in that respect. And I agree with you that having people on the streets and live music does that.
Yeah.
Is an important part of it.
Yeah. Because I had a discussion with a mutual friend of ours, one of my first interviews, and we talked about how, do you think that there will be a renaissance of these places? Because the expectation is once COVID starts to lose its grip, that there will be a huge rush to go and see things again and to be outside. And you think it might be a good opportunity, or do you think that the time has come and gone for these clubs, or new ones will come up?
I know there are an awful lot of musicians who sure as hell want to get back into clubs and play.
Absolutely.
There are an awful lot of bartenders and waiters who want to get back into clubs and start slinging beer.
Yeah.
And it comes back to, again, that dedicated owner.
Yeah.
Can I take the risk?
Right.
And I think that's what it's going to fall on.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of those owners, that was their livelihood as well. So as for a renaissance, I'm crossing my fingers.
You've been going down there since 1968?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
I've been a downtown kid all the whole 50 years I've been here.
Right. And it really started Started New York and went all the way down and then east and west from Yonge Street, at Queen. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people don't realize how many great acts were actually spawned out of Yonge Street and came to play on Yonge Street or in some of the clubs.
Well, Toronto has an interesting thing about clubs. Well, it started back in 1947.
Yeah.
When Ontario changed the liquor laws and allowed cocktails to be served.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you could have a bar where you could serve cocktails and no food.
Right.
Well, now you've got cocktail bars.
Right.
How do you get people into cocktail bars? You play live music.
Right.
People will come and go and see live music.
Yeah.
For all the musicians who were touring at that time, who were doing the Nashville, Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, to New York City circuit, to add Toronto into that was a blessing. It's an extra week, 2 weeks worth of work. And for a lot of them, it was a really nice place to play.
Yeah. It started, so I guess you're saying that they started out with jazz musicians and jazz acts. Was that the majority of it at that point?
Jazz was popular in the 50s.
Yeah.
And Toronto had a lot of downtown jazz clubs.
Right.
And there was about 7 or 8 of them. And they would literally compete with each other for who was booking the biggest act of the week.
Right.
There was a lot of talent.
Yeah. It's funny because you mentioned that because I was going to say, I didn't see George's Spaghetti House on the list, but I guess, are you going to get around to that one?
It's on my list.
Yeah, because that was a famous...
My list is so long. And every time I talk to somebody, they give me another one. It's wonderful.
Yeah. It just keeps going, doesn't it? It also, I guess, in some way gives a history of the cultural life of Toronto at that point, and also the sort of, I guess, Toronto itself, because when I got here back in 1974, it was slightly sort of, you almost got a sense that Toronto was slightly backwater, but it wasn't. It almost seems like a small town.
Well, that was the thing, is we wanted to be a big city.
Yeah.
And we were suffering growing pains, shall we say.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's been that feeling for a long time of Toronto wanting to be a world-class city, but still being labeled Hogtown or Toronto the Good and whatnot. And so it's been a while, and now that we've finally shaken off those shackles, we are a big world-class city.
So you mentioned the Silver Dollar, and that place was around for a heck of a long time.
Yeah.
That was some real mainstay on Spadina, wasn't it?
Very much so. I saw one of my all-time favorite bands there. It was a band called the Night Losers. And they were a band from Transylvania. And they played American roots music. So when they did 6 days on the road, it was 6 days on a Romanian country road.
Wow. That must have been an adventure.
They had a guy played the leaf.
Really?
Remember as kids we used to put leaves between our thumbs and we'd blow into them to make a sound? This guy played the leaf.
Wow. So real folk music.
Oh, very much so, yeah. A fun band.
Now, there was also, you talked about the one I never went to because I was too young by the time it closed. It was the Brown Derby.
Now, the Brown Derby is an interesting one, and that the Silver Rail was ostensibly the first place to buy a cocktail in Ontario.
Right.
And it was started by 2 guys whose names I can't remember.
Back in 1947.
And the day they opened, there was a lineup around the block.
Wow.
Buy a $1.50 cocktail.
Yeah.
They made money hand over fist that first couple of years. So much so that there was a falling out.
Okay.
And so they couldn't agree. Went before a judge. A judge did the Solomon split them in half thing. You get the club, you get a whole shitload of cash.
Right.
Well, the guy who got the whole wad of cash, he walked up the street and he opened the Brown Derby.
Okay. And so it was a live venue for, what kind of acts did they have?
The Brown Derby had 3 different rooms.
Right.
The main room had a rotating bandstand.
Okay.
In the middle of the center floor.
Okay.
Which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
But it was, again, jazz and blues, which was very popular at the time.
Right.
But there was also, upstairs was honky tonk.
Okay.
and sing along.
Yeah.
There was a Nickelodeon room, and the thing that guy learned was the way to get patrons into the seats and buying those $1.50 cocktails was you play music of all kinds. You get people singing.
Yeah. Was that on Young Street, the Brown Derby?
The Brown Derby was right at the northeast corner of Yonge and Dundas.
Okay. You also mentioned the Matador, which was quite a famous landmark for many people in this city.
The Matador was the place you always ended up.
Yeah, it was an after-hours club.
Yeah, it was an after-hours bar, and it never had a liquor license. Now, you could go over to the corner and you could buy a Mickey off the old lady for $10, but it never had a liquor license. Right. But it would run till 5, 6 in the morning. And so after you'd gone to Convento Rico or you'd been downtown and whatnot, you'd go stop in at the Matador and catch some absolutely phenomenal country and western music, generally speaking. It was that kind of venue. And you'd dance until 5 in the morning.
And there weren't that many after-hours clubs at that point, were there, in Toronto?
No. Toronto was still being Toronto the good. And the Matador was tolerated.
Yeah, okay. It was one of those things that they kind of left alone.
The Matador was college in Ossington.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, right. I used to go there with my Newfie friends because at one point it was a Newfoundlanders sort of hangout for a while. I guess it was back in the late 70s. I went there a few times. Now, another one is that people might know Alec Lifeson of Rush, the famous Canadian rock band. And I believe he owned a place called the Orbit Room. Is that right?
He became a silent partner.
Okay.
It was so silent, everybody knew about it.
Yeah.
And so he just wanted a place to play.
Yeah.
And so he partnered with a guy by the name of Tim Nodder, and they opened this club. And it's a small club.
Yeah.
Maybe 200. I don't even know there's 200 seats in there.
Right.
And they would have regular music. There was a house band called the Dexters.
Yeah.
There was the Satellites.
Yeah.
So there was, again, regular bands playing on a weekly basis.
Did he actually play there?
And every now and then, Alex would show up and go, I want to play.
Oh, okay.
And, well, it's his club, so yeah, you got to let the owner play, don't you?
That was a relatively new place, considering all the history of some of the others.
I believe it's about 1995.
Yeah,
when it first opened.
That would make sense. Yeah, I remember it.
And closed in about 2020. Closed a couple of years ago. And is sadly missed. And there is the potential for it to come back again, apparently.
That wouldn't surprise me. Hopefully that'll happen. Now, another place you also have, and I know this place very well because I used to hang out in Kensington, was Graffiti's.
Yes.
And that place was really, it went through many itinerations. And when I was hanging out there, there was it was sort of the beginning of the punk movement, that kind of thing. There are all kinds of bands that played there. Again, a small joint.
The heavy metal breakfast.
Yeah, that's right. And it was just, it was a real rocking place in the middle of Kensington Market at night. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And during the days on weekends.
Throw the windows open and make some noise.
Yeah, that was basically it. So I remember that. Well, I thought it was great the way you captured it because it really looked like it looked. You know, when you walked by, there was graffiti.
Well, the important thing, one of the things that they did was they put the band in the front window.
Right.
As opposed to putting them in the back of the house or at the side of the house. And they had that wonderful garage door window.
Right.
So that when you opened up the window, when the weather allowed, you could walk by and you were backstage.
Right.
It was magical.
Yeah. I think they influenced a lot of other clubs, small restaurants and clubs to do that, didn't they? Because I started after that one, I started seeing them opening up here and there.
Yeah, it was a successful idea.
And when you recorded it, or when you saw the pictures of it, it definitely looks like you were standing across the street on the other side, so southbound.
Yeah.
And that's what it really looked like. So, and it looked like when I used to walk by the place, that's how I picture it. You know what I mean? So
I almost put people on the sidewalk, but I declined.
And you talked about the Silver Rail. That was the first bar to serve a cocktail in Ontario. And that was down closer to...
That was Yonge and Shooter.
Yonge and Shooter, yes, that's right. Yeah, and that was open for quite a few years. It didn't close until...
A long time, yeah.
Closed in 2007. And then there was, it's funny, a Montreal Bistro.
The Montreal Bistro was a wonderful little upscale jazz club.
Right.
And they did a lot for local Toronto musicians.
Yeah. But
they also brought in Oscar Peterson, Diana Krall, and people of that caliber.
Yeah.
So it was a night, like I said, it was upscale. It was a nice upscale
And
club.
it had the clout to get those people in, didn't it?
Yeah.
Now, here's one, the Edge. And I hung out at the Edge quite a bit.
The Edge was one of the places that I never got to.
Yeah, I can tell you it was a dump, but it was great. Well, there was one day I was in a place called the Outer Edge, which was sort of a patio on the outside of it. And I looked in and there was a band playing and there weren't really that many people there. And it turned out that they were the Police. And I just said, "Oh, that sounds good." And I just hung out on the patio for the next couple of hours. But at that time, it was definitely, you could see some really good.
It wasn't around for long.
No,
it was only around for 2.5, 3 years, and yet during that time, it had a phenomenal impact on the music scene here in Toronto. They were booking bands who became really well known, like you say. The Police played there, crying out loud. The other thing about that was that it was always a restaurant.
Right.
And so that meant that underagers could get in and go see the music.
Yeah, that's true.
Where they couldn't in a lot of other places.
Yeah. But I was hanging around there, I guess in the very late 70s. I was there quite a few times before it closed. But I remember seeing people like Martha and the Muffins. I didn't see the B-52s, but but I saw quite a few other bands.
Yeah, a lot of good music went through there. It swung bigger than its weight.
Yeah, and it really was sort of a part of the established kind of what they called new wave and post-punk scene, wasn't it?
Very much so. I mean, in many respects, it was the center point of a lot of that here in Toronto.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you also mentioned Rancho Relaxo, which is a bit later.
Rancho Relaxo, I mean, that's early 2000s.
Yeah.
Rancho was fun. It's a funny place in that basically it was a Mexican restaurant downstairs.
Yep.
And then the upstairs venue was, who's going to play here? Well, we're not sure.
Yeah.
Who wants to play here? Okay. And so it went through all kinds of iterations. I remember seeing the flamenco show there. And then there was also new wave shows and punk shows and headbangers and indie acts.
Yeah.
It was, if you want to play on our stage, fine. You can bring people in, fine.
I always thought that it was a place where they'd get the runoff from Sneaky D's.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Yeah, and that point, it really had established itself with a few other places along that strip, along College, as a really sort of indie kind of mid-90s and early 2000s mainstay. In many ways.
Queen Street's a little bit poorer cousin.
Yeah. So have you been to all these places yourself? Were you there at any point during your time in Toronto?
Pretty much. I mean, I was looking at this a couple of days ago, and I realized I think there's about 4 of them that I hadn't been in.
Right.
Children came along and cut down my club going activity somewhat.
Okay.
And I got older, and the clubs got younger, and so it was that too.
Yeah, because at some point you don't want to be standing out there saying,
I don't want to be the 60-year-old guy standing in line to get into Cool House.
and pretending that you're looking for your kids.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I know what you mean. I sort of got to that point too. Although we shouldn't feel that way. If you're young at heart,
No.
What the hell?
Exactly.
Now, you also talk about Hugh's Room, because there was a time when there was a lot of folk music played here, places like the Horseshoe.
Toronto has a long history of folk music. Very much so. Going back to the Gerrard Street Village, which is what predated Yorkville.
Right.
And then Yorkville in particular, with the Riverboat and a bunch of other places, is that, folk music's always been around this town.
And great acts, too.
Canada likes singer-songwriters.
Right.
And so having a place for them to go, I mean, they still do. I'm going to a thing on Friday night where it's basically for singer-songwriters.
In Yorkville, there were people like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, and as everybody knows now, that started in York, in places like Yorkville, but they must have played a few other places too in Toronto.
I would think so, but basically Yorkville was the magnet for anything and everything at that point in time.
And of course, there were places like, and as I said, the Horseshoe and...
Now, the Horseshoe's interesting.
Yeah.
And when, as we mentioned before, in 1947, when they changed the laws in Ontario to allow cocktail bars,
right,
there were seven bars, I believe it was, that got the original licenses.
Right.
Horseshoe was one of them.
Okay.
And so it has stuck around longer than any club.
Right. So, and then there's the Rivoli and places like that. But I remember they were also, I mean, in the mid 70s, there were also small places that would have people like Stomping Tom and other sort of Canadian folk acts that would play out of there.
Because you could fill the house.
Yeah.
People were willing to go out and see live music.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure there is as much of that these days.
Yeah. What I noticed in those days, too, is that Toronto they really liked bar bands that were cover bands.
Yeah.
I don't remember seeing as many downtown. It tended to be a thing that you saw in suburbia or out in the rural areas or small towns. And there were acts that would just travel throughout Ontario and farther afield. And they would play these like small bars and restaurants. Was there anything like that in Toronto? I remember the Gasworks was one of them.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of rock bands played there.
Yeah.
And not every rock band makes their own music.
Yeah.
So it was not unusual to hear cover bands. Yeah. No doubt about that at all.
The Rodon, is that the Rotunda Tavern?
Oh, okay. The Rondon,
yes.
Which is the corner of Roncesvalles and Dundas.
Okay.
The Rondon Tavern was unusual for a couple of reasons. First of all, it started in the 1930s as a roadhouse on the way to Toronto.
Okay.
Once again, Ontario changed its liquor laws in 1970.
Okay.
And they allowed women to go into bars by themselves.
Oh, so it had a bit of history.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that was when the Rondon changed from an event ballroom into a nightclub.
Okay.
Because all of a sudden women could come in and actually sit at the bar.
Okay.
The other thing about it was that at that point in time, Ward 1 in Toronto, which was High Park, Swansea, out towards Jane Street, was still dry.
Okay.
There was no alcohol in Ward 1.
And for our listeners out there, Toronto had been a dry city for many, many years throughout its history.
Toronto has a long history of the temperance movement, very much.
Yeah, and there were sections of the city where, for instance, Hyde Park and Parkdale that were dry.
And so the Rondon Tavern was the closest venue to Ward 1 that's had live music and was big enough that people could go there.
Yeah.
And it lasted about 15 years.
And there was a history of small concert halls, wasn't there? Like, because, places where you'd see in the late 70s or late 60s and early 70s, bands like Led Zeppelin and...
Yeah, that was the rock pop.
Right.
Yeah, going back to the Rondon for just a quick trivia, that was the first place in Toronto that Bryan Adams played.
Oh, okay.
But going back to the concert hall thing, there's a place at Yonge and Davenport called the Masonic Temple.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever been in there, but it's one of my favorite venues in this town.
I spent a lot of time in there.
Oh, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous
place.
It is. So in the late 60s, it was the rock pile.
Right.
And you saw the top rock acts for $4, $5.
Wow.
It was ridiculous. As the story goes, Led Zeppelin, when they came to North America for their first tour, the first place they played was the rock pile.
All right.
And we got to see them for $4.
Right.
And they signed a contract then because they were just this unknown band that their last stop on the tour would be Toronto.
Right.
So they go to New York, they go down to the States and hit it absolutely massive. Then all of a sudden, they've got to come back and play the rock pop.
Right.
Well, as the story goes, a financial dispute occurred and things got settled, but nobody was happy.
Yeah, a couple of that you mentioned. Pool House was the beginning, in some ways, I guess, of this sort of dance club / live venue, was it?
Yeah. The Government was a massive complex. This is one of the ones that I've never been in. But it was a massive, and like you say, it was DJs and it was dance music. Let's go get crazy and dance all night long. And they also had live acts.
Right. I saw a few of them there, actually.
Oh, well, who'd you see?
I saw Stereolab, and who else was there? I can't remember. You have to excuse me because things are a little bit hazy.
It's allowed. Yeah.
Now, and of course, we have to talk about the Bamboo Club.
Yeah.
Because that place was really, it really gained...
The Bamboo Club is close to a lot of people's hearts.
Yeah, I know, and he used to attract a lot of people from and a lot of tourists, like kids that are coming from out of town, from the States or from
Yeah.
or across Canada or even Europe. That I would always see them in lineups and talk with them, and they played some really great acts there. It had a very particular vibe about it, didn't it?
Yes, very much so. It was alive.
Yeah,
Always. And it was fun and it was free. And one of the things that I particularly liked about it was what it did for music.
yeah,
Um, it had a specific focus on Caribbean music.
right.
But what came out of that was this Toronto as a world music city.
Yep.
And for quite a while there was this mishmash of music in Toronto that really did not fit into any genre.
Right.
And it sort of got the tag of world music on it.
Yeah.
And the bamboo is totally right in the middle of that.
Yeah. And it really was, in my mind, the first time that I could see acts that you generally wouldn't have seen,
Oh, no.
the reggae bands and all kinds of other new music and world music that appealed to a lot of people, but they just couldn't see it. And the bamboo was really one of the places.
And to see them in a club where you could get up close and dance with them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I remember seeing the Satellites, those guys there a few times. In some ways, it really put Queen Street on the map.
Very much so.
In the sense that everybody...
It was very much at the forefront of Queen.
Yes. And it became sort of one of those places that was accessible to the whole of Toronto, whereas in the past, Queen Street had kind of been... there were particular types of people that would go down to...
It was kind of grungy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But people from Scarborough and that would come to see bands there, whereas before that there hadn't been that many people. Queen Street wasn't as popular with the majority of Torontonians.
I also know that the bamboo was responsible for probably 40% of the population of Toronto having pad thai for the first time in their life.
Yes, absolutely. I remember that the menu was very, very varied.
Yep.
And it had a really good rep for that kind of thing. Yeah, it definitely had this particular flavor to it.
It was not a franchise operation, that's for damn sure. But it was catch as catch can. It almost looked like it was cobbled together.
Okay.
They found the bar in Buffalo.
Wow.
So they literally took a truck to Buffalo and picked up the bar. And it was that kind of flavor to it, that grab a piece here, grab a piece there, and let's just put it together. Oh, look what we built.
That was great. Yeah, it really felt that way. But in a way, it didn't. It felt that way, but it also felt like you were entering a really sort of an art-oriented bar that catered to artists or it just had that vibe about it, And I guess being near OCAD and places like that probably helped it out.
Yeah. Do you know about the Toronto Music Museum?
Yes.
Their museum, which is for the people who don't know, it is in the Shoppers Drug Mart, which used to be the Hard Rock Cafe, just south of Dundas Square. There is a small part in there that is a music museum, and their exhibit currently is the history of Caribbean music in Toronto, and features the bamboo.
For our listeners, whereabouts is that? It's on Yonge Street, where the Hard Rock is?
It's Yonge, just south of Dundas Square. It's the building that is now a Shoppers Drug Mart.
Yep.
But in past iterations, it was the Hard Rock Cafe.
Right.
And before that, it was the Friars Tavern.
Oh, I remember the Friars.
Yeah. And so again, it's a long story history. And they, up on the second floor towards the front of the building, is a small museum.
And it's funny you should mention that because, as I said, a few years after I got here, there was a huge influx of West Indian immigrants.
That was the wave of the time, yeah.
Yeah, and I can tell you that late at night on very hot summer nights, they would have huge sound systems going all over the place and in different buildings and that kind of thing. And reggae really became the sort of background, the background sound of Jane and Finch in some ways.
Very cool.
And then I started seeing that it was slowly starting to seep into the clubs downtown, and eventually places like the Bamboo started playing acts like that.
Uh-huh.
Now, we should mention the Chicken Deli because I was only there, I think I was only there once. but it was sort of off the beaten track in some ways. But they had really,
Very much so.
and they had a really good jazz club there, didn't they?
It was Mount Pleasant, just south of Eglinton.
Yeah,
it was called the Chicken Deli, but I don't ever remember seeing anything deli on the menu.
right.
And like you say, it was a local jazz club, and thrived. And you notice that a lot in Toronto. There were these little pocket clubs, all outside of downtown that
sort of neighborhood bars, almost, weren't they? Yeah. It started getting real popularity when Toronto went through that period where Yonge and Eglinton was, they used to call it Yuppieville.
Yeah.
There was a huge influx of upwardly mobile.
Well, there's a lot of people living there and a lot of young people living there.
Yeah. I remember that because I wanted to be one of them, but it was so hard to get an apartment in those days. I guess that would be the early 80s in some ways, mid 80s. And I got the sense that the Chicken Deli would really started to pick up steam at that point. People started to really hang out there.
Yep.
But again, like I said, I was only there once. There were other scenes in other places around the city. Is there any that you have not sort of got around to making yet, or?
Nothing comes to mind.
Right.
I'm sure there are. And if I was to look at my list, which is buried deep under a pile of papers, I'd find some.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to make a conscious effort to do things, places that are other than my recollections and my generation.
Right.
That, it's only fair.
Well, because it's such a history in Toronto of really good, of music. And in many ways, it's at the forefront of culture in Toronto, I think.
Well,
because
you mentioned it with the influx of Caribbean music.
Right.
That as this town has gone through its waves of immigration that were fairly well defined ethnically.
Yeah.
There would be the Italian and the Portuguese wave, and there was the Jewish wave before that. And as you mentioned, there was the West Indian wave, and then the Eastern European wave. And each one of things brings their own music.
Right.
And slowly but surely, Toronto goes, oh, that's pretty cool. Let's incorporate that.
Yeah, it definitely sort of had a real desire to learn about world music in many ways, and just different kinds of music. They were really thirsty for something new, weren't they?
Yeah, very much.
And I think at that point, I guess the period that we're talking about, late 70s and early to mid 80s, Toronto, that's when it started to change, didn't it? It sort of morphed from being a small town kind of backwater mentality to a much more...
We got rid of the Hogtown shackle.
Yeah, it became much more sophisticated, didn't it?
We grew up a bit.
I remember that quite distinctly. It was sort of one of those things where, in 75, you're walking down Yonge Street and it was the same old story. You do the strip up and down. And then by 82, 83, it was completely different.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Yonge Street anymore, that kind of thing.
No, Yonge Street, that was just after Yonge Street especially downtown Yonge Street, went through that major decline.
Yeah.
And needed a touch-up, shall we say.
Yeah.
It needed a facelift.
Yeah, it definitely did. I mean, and to be honest with you, that kind of music, the rock hated at that point to really sort of rock music as opposed to, I mean, you had the Gasworks, you had, what was it, the Young Station, you had a few places.
Piccadilly Tube.
The Tube, yeah, and they did have, the Tube, I remember that place really well. I mean, they did have a couple of clubs that were sort of new wave dance places, that kind of dance clubs.
But those were the people who were sitting in the seats and buying the booze. So
that's right.
That was who you catered to.
So you said you're going to be expanding on this because this is really fascinating. And I can tell you that I've posted that short video that was made outside of the museum that went through the museum window. And people were absolutely, they loved it.
Oh, I know. The response I've gotten to putting those in my friend's window has been through the roof.
Yeah.
I've been fairly private about this whole thing for about the past 8-9 months. I'd make one and I'd post pictures on Facebook and everybody go, yeah, nice, Andrew. But to get them all together as a group, they're real. I'm impressed. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what it seemed like. It seemed like they worked much, and I think you mentioned that they seem to work a lot better together as opposed to one.
Oh yes, very much so.
And it was because I think for many people, it was almost like you're literally walking down memory lane
Yeah, it's
because,
become a thing where you look at it and your brain goes, "Oh, I remember,"
yeah,
and and it's a thing for people to hang their stories on.
especially if they hung out there. And of course, and especially if as you said, they're now closed and silent.
Yeah.
From a particular period, say from the people I knew, sort of from the late 70s right through the mid 90s, there were a lot of people that were they were reminiscing, and there were stories about it, and stories about what happened there and who played there. And
Well, one of the things I've noticed on Facebook these days, and I have to give credit to Facebook for this, is that there are an awful lot of reminiscence pages.
yes, there are.
If I make a model, I'm pretty much guaranteed I can find a page on Facebook of memories of the Rondon Tavern. And
Yeah. So in the end, what this is all about.
in the end, it's keeping Andrew sane, and I go back to that very much. So this is surprisingly enough, I was thinking about it, was that the pandemic has given me the most productive years that I've had in decades.
Right. Yeah. And
which is rather fun. Partly because I'm staying home and I'm working and whatnot. But I'm enjoying doing it. I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy putting this. Come on, you tell me stories.
And also, I mean, credit to you, Andrew. This is really part of, and I always say this, an uncredited the Toronto music scene and the Toronto clubs and the cultural aspects of the cultural nightlife of Toronto is really underrated. It would never
Amen.
Yeah, and it never really got any, exposure or credit the way it should have.
It's a big part of what made this city what it was and what it is. No question about that at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly on that point. I hope that you continue with this venture. It's really great.
I fully intend to. I jokingly say that I would be putting the last nail in as they put me in my coffin, because it really does feel like a legacy project for me as well.
Yeah.
This is a way for me to give back to this city that's given me so much over the years.
And it keeps you going too, doesn't it?
That too.
And I must say, I was very impressed, as many people were, Andrew. You did a great job.
Thank you very much.
In conveying it. As you said, it wasn't a photographic approximation, but it was really well done. And I think that's really the draw in many ways, why people appreciate it so much. Do you have any plans to show it?
At this point in time, my living room is my gallery. It was so naked when they were in the gallery.
Yeah.
What my plan is down the road to have a large historical educational exhibit.
Okay.
I've done a couple of portrait and words exhibits in the past.
Right.
And what I would like to do is miniatures and words.
Okay.
And I'd like to have about 30 of them.
Okay.
On some walls somewhere.
I know that there's initiatives to put together, well, it was supposed to be, to put together art spaces like for young artists and artists alike, a lot more than there are now, that were easily accessible to both the artists and patrons. Have you heard anything about that? Are you being approached by anybody?
No.
Okay.
At this point in time, I am just going to happily build until I hit 25 or 30.
Yeah.
And then I will start looking at the idea of what do we do with it next. I do have some history with my museum and doing exhibits for them, and there are a couple of places I'd like to see it go. I wouldn't mind seeing it in the Toronto Archives for 6 months. I think that would be kind of nice.
Yeah.
But we'll see. It'll find a home. I have no doubt.
So that's the future for Andrew Smith.
Yep. He's going to keep fiddling in his basement and keeping his sanity.
That's great. Well, listen, Andrew, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Faisal.
A very fascinating look. And what's great is that you also have the history behind it, too. You've done the research in terms of history.
Yep.
That really it gives it a different dimension in many ways, past the doors of the place, if you know what I mean.
More stories.
Well, listen, thank you very much. And maybe what we can do is after you get to that 25, we could do another episode featuring some of the new stuff.
Most assuredly.
And it's been a real joy speaking to you.
Likewise. I've enjoyed this myself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal.
Bye-bye. That was my conversation with Andrew Smith about a series of miniatures that Andrew crafted and put on display. Hopefully we'll see them in venues soon. Thanks very much for joining me today on Channel F Podcast. See you next time. This episode was produced and edited by Faisal Sheriff. Assistant editor and technical supervisor, Lori H. Music by M.E. Additional sound design by Faisal Sheriff. This has been a Channel F production. This is Channel F Podcasting. You're listening to Channel F.